Hello and welcome, Exiles, to my review of the Path of Exile 2 Early Access. Now, this is an early access that I very much enjoy and I want to see improved. This video is not necessarily meant to be like PoE 2 bad or PoE 2 good or one way or another. This is just about my objective or subjective criticisms of the game and things that I hope they improve or change their mind on. I'm going to be emphasizing specifically design decisions. These are things I have issues with, and I'm hoping I can convince you and maybe eventually the GG devs that they should change their mind on some of these things. I'm not talking about balance issues, like, for example, Archmage being mandatory in spell builds or Hand of Wisdom in action being in every single attack build. This isn't really a design decision. That's more of a balance issue, and that's something that's going to be changed and fixed as they add more content, as they do balance patches. I'm not worried about that stuff necessarily. And this is not a comprehensive, all-inclusive list. This is just primary thoughts that came to mind when thinking about this video I'm making. Now, what do I like? It's the obvious stuff. I really love the boss fights. They're incredible. The visuals, the uncut gem system, and pretty much every system they yoinked one for one from PoE. If it worked in PoE and they yoinked it one for one, I probably liked it because I liked PoE 1 to begin with. Now, as for things that I am not convinced of, and the meat of this video, and probably the biggest one of them all, is the crafting system. For me, Path of Exile 1's crafting was something no other ARPG had. It was incredible. It was magnificent. And I am just simply not convinced by the current PoE 2's system. And I'll go through a bit of your options if you want to craft in PoE 1 and my issues with them. Now, option 1 is you pick up an item off the ground and you identify it. This is the identification scroll lottery, basically. And simply, if it has 4 mods, 5 mods, whatever it is, you're just going to Exalt Slam it. I don't really view this as crafting. This is pretty much just, did you drop a good item or not? I don't really feel like this gives you any real satisfaction like PoE 1 did in terms of crafting an item. And you could fight me on this, but I'm sorry, the item you picked up and ID'd, you did not craft, you just found a good item on the ground. In PoE 1, if I found a good item on the ground and ID'd it, I would never have said I crafted a good item. I would just be like, holy crap, look at this cool rare I found. I wouldn't be saying I crafted it. Number 2, you have a good item with a couple bad stats, and then your option is basically a Chaos Orb, or technically you could annul Exalt, but this is the same outcome regardless. If you successfully annul the mod, you're going to Exalt it. There's no other option. And the thing is, for me, this is just gambling. This doesn't really feel like crafting. It might feel good sometimes when you really hit the RNG, where you hit the 1 in 6, where you annul the bad stat and put on a good stat or whatever, but this doesn't really give the high of feeling like you made something. I don't really view this as crafting. Maybe other people do, but it's too close to just being gambling, in my opinion. You're taking a semi-good item and you're either making it bad or making it good. With one click, you're rolling the dice and either you get a good or bad outcome. As for option 3, you have a perfectly good item with no bad stats and you decide to Val Orb this. This is just, in my opinion, high stakes gambling. There's higher risk. There is a chance you entirely brick the item versus you add an extra good stat or nothing changes. Ultimately, none of these options really feel to me like you have crafted something. You can tell me differently that you feel like you are crafting something, that you're making something, but I don't really feel like these systems feel that way at all. Option number 4 is omens. These are incredibly deterministic, which means they're super freaking powerful. Thus, they have to be super rare, which basically just means it's mere tier crafting only. If you're using an Omen of Whittling on your item, that crafting resource itself costs like 7-8 divines. That's a really good item to begin with to be even worth 7 or 8 divines. This is super limited to basically only the 0.1%. And I'm sorry, most players just don't even see. I haven't personally ever dropped one of these omens. I've done a lot of ritual. I've never even seen one. This is not something that exists as far as I'm concerned for the vast majority of players. I'm not sure you can count this. This is crafting to some extent, but it doesn't exist for basically everyone. And then option 5 is essences, where you pick up a bunch of bases, you repeatedly use an essence plus an augment orb plus a greater essence plus some exalts. This, I feel like, is getting close to being crafting, but it's super tedious and it's not necessarily fun. At least I don't view it as particularly fun as picking up just hundreds of the same base over and over again and doing this repeat crafting attempt. I'm not necessarily sold on this as being what I want to picture as, oh, I'm crafting, let me go pick up 100 bases. And the point I'm getting at, with all of these systems, it doesn't really feel, there is no satisfying, I made this item factor to it. It doesn't really feel that way. The essence thing, you can kind of feel like you made it, but it's also super tedious and unenjoyable. And the point I'm getting at is, in PoE 1, you could take an item from scratch, and there's a step-by-step crafting process where you could do something to get an outcome that is desirable specifically for the thing you're trying to make. For example, I made a video about how to craft a +2 chaos wand for my Hexblast build at one point. And that was specifically a step-by-step process which could guarantee you to get +2 things. It cost some resources, it took some time, but there was an expected cost, there was a way to do it, and you could formulate a strategy to make that happen. And the thing is, this exists not just for +2 Chaos Wands, it exists for pretty much every item in PoE 1. There is a way or a step-by-step process you can come up with to take an item and make this thing exist. And this, in my opinion, is largely tied to scours. It's largely tied to having a repeatable currency, like where you could spam essences and constantly get the essence tier strength on a ring or whatever. The point is, there is currencies that allow you to take a base and repeatedly craft on this. I know, or at least in my opinion, I think the reason they did what they did, where they got rid of scours, where they got rid of repeatable usable currency on a base, is in order to make items valuable on the ground, you have to get rid of the ability to take a base from scratch and make it good. And I gotta be honest, I'm not convinced it's a worthwhile trade. I love crafting. I think it's one of the funnest things you can do in PoE 1, one of the best parts of the game. And I am not convinced that making the items on the ground more valuable by getting rid of the ability to craft an item from scratch is worth that trade-off. I think in PoE 1, as it is currently, if I'm doing, for example, a league start or just an SSF run, I value the items on the ground. I'm going to pick them up. I'm going to ideally scroll them. That is an efficient way to play the game. And eventually, over time, as you get later in the trade league, that becomes less of a thing. And I'm okay with that because you've moved on, your gear's gotten better and better and better, and you've expanded to the point where you have all these crafting resources and you can actually take an item and make something cool with it or whatever. But the thing is, you still value those items on the ground initially on a league start environment or in an SSF run because it is valuable at that point, because that's how you're acquiring your gear upgrades initially, because the item that drops on the ground has a chance to be better than your current gear. Obviously, as you get farther on and progress, that item on the ground no longer has a chance to be better or worth something on the market, generally speaking, and is not worth picking up. But I would largely prefer being able to craft an item from scratch and actually have the satisfying system of feeling like you made something versus not having that system at all and then having a more extended period of time where it's worth picking up items on the ground. I would also say I am not convinced in PoE 2 that, at least in the trade environment, I am not convinced that this new system even stops it from getting to the point where it's not worth picking up items to an extent. It still feels like once you get developed enough gear, you stop caring so much about those rares on the ground and you start hiding more and more of it. So I feel like we've traded a good ability to have a crafting system in order to have something where it makes the items more valuable, and it does make the items on the ground more valuable, but ultimately you still get to a point of progression where you don't care about the items on the ground. So I'm not sure this trade-off is worth it. You can tell me what you think, but ultimately the crafting system as it stands, if they're not willing to grab scour, or they're not willing to give us something like scours or repeatable usable currencies, which is a design decision, then I think crafting will feel largely lackluster and won't really feel like you're crafting things. Obviously, as they add more currencies to the pool of ways to modify items, it will help this issue, but I'm not sure it'll solve it unless they cave and they're willing to give us back scours, they're willing to give us back alterations. I'm simply just not convinced without those items, crafting can feel like you're actually crafting, if that makes sense. Next up, the other design decision I'm not convinced about is no life on the tree. Now, originally this was suggested that life nodes are mandatory, and if they're mandatory, we don't want them on the tree. Like, for example, GGG has a big problem with things that feel like they're mandatory, thus there's no choice there, thus it's something that shouldn't exist, is the line of thinking. But I would argue currently, after playing the system, I'm not necessarily convinced. For one, were life nodes mandatory to begin with, and thus limiting your decision how you make your build? I don't think they were mandatory. I think there is a large array of how you could choose to build your character, and there were people that made builds with 0% life on them. I might personally think that those were bad builds. I might think the 2k life rangers were just waiting to die and that's an unfun playstyle or whatever, but people chose to do it. And there are reasons, for example, making a glass cannon specifically for doing something like a no-hit run. There are reasons why you would do that, and thus there is a choice. And there's also the people that would invest way more than other builds would invest, 200+% versus a build that would invest like maybe 100%, where they're just super going into it. And that is a decision you make while making your character. And I still think it is one I value, because I don't look at it as limiting your defensive option. I look at it as it gives life characters the option of, am I scaling my raw EHP, like your life number, versus do I scale mitigation, versus do I scale more damage? And I think that is a valuable choice. What ends up happening when you don't give life on the tree is you just don't have that option to scale your EHP. And your option is, do I scale just more of some mitigation layers, or do I scale damage? And that's just, to me, that's one less vector of choice. And currently, I'm not convinced at all that it was the correct one to get rid of life nodes. There's also the balance issue of percent ES. There's way too much of it on the tree, and it makes it so much more glaringly obvious of like, do you ever choose life builds? No, you don't. You just click ES and you grab the ES nodes, and your character's just way tankier because there's just so much raw amounts of it in comparison. But that's more of a balance issue. The design issue, I believe, is the choice of no life on the tree, and I'm not convinced by it after having played it. Next up, I have gem levels on items. They chose to give gem levels of +3, +5, +2. I think this is just way too much of a pass-fail check. It's a matter of, is this item even usable, in my opinion? And I don't necessarily like it, because there are a lot of times where you'd have an item that you could consider good because it has a lot of nice stats on it, but because it doesn't have the plus level stat, you cannot even consider it because so much of the value is tied to these stats. An example I'll give is if you go to PoE trade, and I took my weighted sum and I made it a 1500 value weight. This is an example of taking mods you care about and assigning a value. I'm not perfect. I'm not a machine. There's probably a better way to attribute value, but I valued plus levels at 150 value per stat, which means a +5 wand would be worth 750 value. And this is how valuable I put all the other stats. Now, if we're specifically looking for +5 wands that have at least 1500 value, and we search this specific stat, we're looking at wands that half of their total value, half of their total worth in terms of my weighting system, is tied to one of their 6 total stats. They have all the spell damage, they have gain mods, they have crit chance, they have cast speed, they have all these other stats, and half of the power of this wand, I believe, is literally this one stat. It is a pass-fail check. Do you have this stat or not? And I'm not necessarily a big fan of having that much power attributed to one singular stat, because it ends up being that case where if you do not have the +2 on your focus, that focus is a bad focus. If you do not have plus levels on your wand, that wand is a bad wand. If you do not have the +3 to the levels on your amulet, that amulet is not usable. Even if there are a lot of other good stats on it, it just fails the check of, does it have the gem levels? So I'm not necessarily convinced about this, having that much power tied to one singular affix on an item. I think it feels weird. I'm hoping they walk back the design decision to give this much power to a singular affix. As for another follow-up to that, it's gem level mana scaling. You'll notice as you scale gem levels, the mana scaling goes exponential with it. Like, it just keeps getting multiplied and multiplied higher and higher. What this ends up doing is it forces spellcasters into basically archmage level mana investment. It is just ridiculous how expensive spells get, and just frankly any ability with gem levels, they get ridiculously expensive, and it ends up making melee abilities like a suicide button. For example, you have Hammer of the Gods and you end up having 2k plus, 3k plus, 4k plus life cost on this one click. You want to do it because it's so much damage and you have to do it. It's mandatory to kill the boss, but it's weird to have so much cost that things like just a regular attack or a skill ends up having the downside of what would have been like Corrupting Fever in PoE 1, or like clicking Val Righteous Fire in PoE 1, like something where that's like part of the downside of the skill that's built in and you understand that portion of it, versus just every single skill you want the gem levels because it's just mandatory for damage, but then it also forces this ridiculous mana problem that just doesn't feel good in my opinion. Next up, we have everybody getting 9 6 links, or the fact that you can have 6 links wherever you want and you have so many sockets and all this stuff. My main issue with this is I think it ends up being where you don't have an opportunity cost in your skill choice. And I feel like this limits build diversity. This is probably one of my most controversial takes I'll have in this video where people might not necessarily agree with this, but hear me out. When you have a character, like say, I want to play a Mace Strike build. We'll just say Mace Strike, for example. I have that skill and I'm going to use it while I'm clearing, whatever, yada, yada. The second I get to a boss, I have to include a second skill called Hammer of the Gods. And it doesn't matter if I'm a Mace Strike build. It doesn't matter if I'm a Molten Blast build. It doesn't matter if I'm using Rolling Slam. For example, you probably wouldn't use a lot of these abilities, but when it comes down to it, no matter what mace skill you're clicking, you're including Hammer of the Gods. And in my opinion, that's not great that you're going to auto include these, because it doesn't really feel like there's a lot of build diversity in maces, because no matter what, you're going to end up clicking Hammer of the Gods because you have no opportunity cost of your 6 link. What I'm saying is in PoE 1, you had to have one skill that was 6 linked. And then if you're getting extra skills that had multi-links, you had to do something extra for it. There was some extra cost, some extra thought that had to go into it. In PoE 2, it's basically just, okay, I'm playing this build, and then when I get to a boss, I want to do single target. I'm just going to click the best skill within my given archetype to do single target, and that ends up making a lot of builds all look the same. The examples I have are casters that are self-cast are going to include Frost Wall in their single target setups. Casters that are trigger are going to have Comet or Lightning Conduit in their trigger setups. Staff builds are going to include the Bell. Crossbow builds are going to use Stroke Burst Browns. Bow builds are going to use Lightning Rod. Like, there's a lot of these skills where it's just like, if I'm playing this build, like say I'm playing Ice Shot or I'm playing Lightning Arrow, like you have multiple different bow skills, but then both of those builds become the same when they get to a boss because both of them are going to use Lightning Rod to get single target. Does that make? Hopefully, I'm making some level of sense. I'm not sure what the best solution to this is, but I'm worried going forward that it's going to limit your ability to have build variety, because it's just the correct option is always whatever is the given best skill for single target within your archetype. And every single build that's within this archetype ends up getting shoehorned into that single target skill because you have no opportunity cost. Nothing's stopping you from having the 6 link on this single target skill for when you get to the boss, and then every build plays the same the second you get to a boss, and that feels a little bit bad in my opinion. Think of that what you will, but that's something that I'm not necessarily sure I agree with as a build decision to give, or a design decision to give builds unlimited 6 links with no opportunity cost outside of just the cost of like buying a perfect jewelers or dropping a perfect jewelers. As for things I'm not necessarily sure about, which is things that I don't know if they're good or bad, but specifically I'm thinking about the endgame system. I think it's solid, but it's just weaker in my opinion than the PoE 1's Atlas system. And the main reason for that is every time you have to do a layout you don't necessarily like, you're not having fun, and you're forced into that layout you don't want to play a lot of times. And I'm guessing this is something maybe they can just solve by adding a system of being able to block certain layouts or whatever. But the beauty of PoE 1's Atlas system is you could find the map you like and just chain that together and enjoy it. Current PoE 2's endgame system of you don't really have choice what layouts you're running, it just starts to rub you the wrong way. Every time you get the Meyer layout, you're like, oh crap, layout is super mazy. I'm going to miss a rare in a certain offshoot little area, and I'm going to have to backtrack for it. And you're like, you start getting salty while you're doing it, or at least I was every time I got the Meyer layout, you know? And that's just like a feels bad situation. I'm not necessarily sure the current end-game system is bad. I think there's some pros to it. I think there's some things that are good about it, but that I'm also unsure about it at the same time. So anyways, these are basically the top things I have maybe issue with in the current early access. Overall, I like the early access a lot, and I just wanted to point out design decisions I don't necessarily agree with. I'm sure there's going to be people that disagree with me or agree with me based on some of the things I said. Either way, I just wanted to start some discussion about it. After having played a lot of Path of Exile 2, I'm at the point where I am probably done with it until more content gets added, because a large amount of these things, if you noticed, limit what I believe is your ability to have build diversity. And until they give us more archetypes to choose, I don't feel like there's much that I can get excited about making, because it just feels like I'm going to be shoehorned into certain things. So I'm currently at the burnt out stage of the PoE2 early access, and I'm doing a hardcore SSF run with Righteous Fire, and I'm gonna see if I can go to do Ubers. So full disclosure, that's where I'm at. I'm just waiting for that next content patch, and then I'll probably hop back on and try PoE2 more. But for right now, that is where it stands for me. Hopefully you guys enjoyed watching the video. As always, thanks for watching, Exiles. Take care and peace out. Have a good one.